I am curious your thoughts on Curtis Samuel and on obviously on Keon Coleman. We know that you are really into Dalton Kincaid, and I agree. I think Kincaid's the guy that if you look at their offseason moves, we often talk about teams kind of tell you what they think. The fact that they were willing to get rid of Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis when only 3 players in their passing game had more than like 55 targets, and that fourth player was James Cook, a running back. 3 downfield players had more than I don't know. I already said earlier Khalil Shakir didn't have very much volume. I'm going to pull it up while I'm filibustering here. But yeah, Khalil Shakir ended up being the 4th downfield weapon. He was at 45 targets. Dawson Knox had 36, right? Gabe Davis, Diggs, and Kincaid all had 80 plus. If you're willing to get rid of Gabe Davis and Diggs and not really add a ton, not go crazy spending, it was surprising they had so many day 3 picks and they didn't add additional wide receivers in the draft. They brought in Curtis Samuel. They've brought in some other veterans like Chase Claypool and Marcus Valdez-Scantling. And obviously they did draft Keon Coleman in the earlier rounds. But if you're going to do all of that, I think you're saying that Dalton Kincaid's 91 targets is likely to expand. That's the one guy that was in the offense last year that actually did pretty well late in the season with Joe Brady. Everyone's talked about the coordinator splits now. Kincaid was solid in the second half, and you got to figure his 91 targets are going forward. That's going to be a staple, particularly early in the year when the other guys are all kind of fitting into this new offense. But how do you see, Shakir has the 45 targets. Can that rise? I'm skeptical because from a targets per out run perspective, I don't feel like we've seen a lot of that. Keon Coleman, some question marks in his profile. Curtis Samuel has been a pretty good target earner. So he's a guy that when I look at this group, I feel like he's got to have a role here. I feel like he's got to have a pretty stable role, and I feel like he's got to get 100-ish targets as well and be a pretty key part of this. But how do you see the Bills sort of working together? I've seen some recent quotes as well where can't remember who said it, but someone was talking about one of the advantages to their offense is that everyone has a turn to shine, sort of similar to what I was just describing with the Seahawks, where they're kind of anticipating in early practices the ball getting spread around a decent amount. What are your thoughts on the Bills?
The Bills are weird. And again, it's a threshold that is somewhat meaningless when I say players going in the first 10 rounds, because Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir just barely get into that. But one of the reasons why I do feel this kind of mild pushback on the idea of selecting Curtis Samuel is that if the draft is also telling me that Khalil Shakir is a viable pick at wide receiver 54, and you did a great job of putting this in context earlier, but that's 2/3 of a round earlier than Adonai Mitchell, who it could be almost a zero, but also could be a league winner. It's a round and a half before Jerry Jeudy, who I continue to believe has a profile that's much better than people realize. Otherwise, maybe there's nobody else that you absolutely have to have. The rest of the picks later than that are very scenario based. But the tricky part for me with Curtis Samuel is that I've always liked Curtis Samuel. I thought he was a good pick last season, but so much of what looks decent about his ability to draw targets is that he didn't run a very high route percentage last year. And so when he is in the game, it somewhat inflates his target drawing ability simply by the fact that those are the plays where he's much more likely to be drawn up as the potential guy. When he played more in 2022, his target drawing potential was below 20% in terms of what SIS uses, which it's not horrible, but again, it's not something that you're going to be drafting at his current price. And then you come in and look at where he's drawing those targets. They're underneath. And so is he good with the ball in his hands? He definitely is. He's a good run after the catch guy. But despite that element, you can blame some of this on Bieniemy, you can blame some of it on certainly Sam Howell. But the overall per route value for Samuel last year was not impressive. And then he doesn't run a lot of routes. you put those two things together, and I mean, he's just such a niche piece that it's hard for me to understand how he could possibly be the guy in a Buffalo Bills offense that dramatically de-emphasized the pass over the second half of last year. Now, one of the things about both Samuel and Shakir going there is that, I mean, obviously people are generally not drafting them on the same team. And they're basically saying, I mean, this is where, from a contingency perspective, that we want to draft them in case one of the two of them wins. So you're actually just making two completely separate bets, as opposed to looking at these two guys as, both being worth that type of price. So from that perspective, I don't have nearly as much problem with it. And you have the element where Keon Coleman has also not been a good target earner. And so with Coleman, what you have is size and highlight plays and personality, right? Kind of unfortunately, because it would be hilarious. I mean, those aren't fantasy categories. And so, in terms of what he's going to do, both for people who are drafting him and what he's going to do to his teammates, yeah, that leaves additional volume there. So for me, part of it comes back to, what are the Bills? Are they what they were in the first half of the season and had generally been, or are they going to be what they were under Joe Brady? Now, he had this interesting quote recently talking about how, I mean, this has to be a Josh Allen offense. He has to be a superstar for them to accomplish their goals. But I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to interpret that quote. One of which is that any type of limits on him as a rusher will be taken off, because you have to have that dynamism in order to move the ball and get that unicorn type of value. The other one would be kind of more back in the direction of, like, why were we trying to win that Chiefs playoff game with James Cook and other running backs who should not be in the NFL? Like, how are you possibly trying to win the game that way when you have Josh Allen? But partly for me, I'm like, I don't see how you're going to be able to win it that way when your starting receiving group in some way, shape, or form is Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, and Khalil Shakir, because Samuel and Shakir are role players. And, if you're talking about getting them at the end of drafts and having that connection between Allen and the player, winning you a week 17, that would make sense to me. Where they're being drafted, and I mentioned again, it's basically completely separate types of things if one wins or the other wins. But even with that kind of being the case, I mean, you're not drafting them for a week 17, hope they blow up. I mean, you need points from them throughout the course of the season. Is the thesis just that the points are going to come somewhere and we don't know, and we should be very sort of agnostic about that? We should have a humility-based approach to it. And that would fit obviously with this thesis we have for the show. But, like, are we thinking about it wrong? Or, each of us individually, are we thinking about it incorrectly? As I look at, like, Keon Coleman versus Ladd McConkey, one of the things that I look at there is that, I mean, you could see McConkey end up getting a huge number of targets and consolidating if he's the guy. And if Justin Herbert plays well and they pass more than people expect, you could see that as a league-winning play. I guess I have a harder time, especially because Coleman, again, based on the SIS numbers, was like 1.5 yards per route below McConkey last year. So a huge gap in terms of what they accomplished from a route perspective in terms of yardage last season. For me, it always comes back to Dalton Kincaid, and the passing offense is going to have to run through him. And I think all three of those guys are role players off of the tight end in what ends up being a run-oriented offense where Josh Allen is also running well. One of the things that's kind of interesting right now in terms of deciding how you want to spend your QB capital is how much of the 15 touchdowns for both Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are you willing to give them again this season? Even though Hurts numbers in some ways you would claim are probably easier to accomplish because they come from a foot away, I might be in terms of the whole package. And even though Jalen Hurts has far better receivers at his disposal,
I'd
I
be
think
more
that
concerned about
yeah,
what were we
more
going to say?
concerned about Hurts
Yeah, right,
because Josh Allen is going to be that rushing machine this year.
right. The way that Josh Allen scores the rushing touchdowns is in a lot of different ways, like unstoppably a locomotive running in different ways. And when he drops back to pass and then takes off, Jalen Hurts is a very systematic thing that if it gets stopped for some reason, we talked about maybe Jason Kelsey's retirement has an impact. Who knows? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe that's overstated. But if something happens to the Eagles' ability to do the tush push and they're not as effective anymore, and it's worth noting that when every team was trying to copy them in season last year, a lot of those other teams struggled. It wasn't as easy as, you know, people like to pick at the analytics community and stuff. I'm definitely guilty of this. I thought everyone should have been QB sneaking a lot more than they should have. But the 2023 season, if you were watching every game down the stretch, you were like, man, there's a lot of situations where that automatic QB sneak wasn't so automatic and really changed the math. Sometimes there's
Well,
a
Ben,
turnover on downs on a 4th and short. I mean, those are big.
do you have any additional insight in terms of that, in terms of what you've seen, what you've heard discussed? Because the first thing that jumps to my mind with that is this element that kind of goes across sports and across, sort of life itself in terms of executing things, which is that, I mean, you can't simply call it in a game because it looks effective and should work. You would have to practice it. And I'm not saying
Yeah.
that they've never lined up and practiced it. I assume all of those teams that ran it in a game had run it in their practices once or twice. But we could still be looking at a gigantic gulf between how the Eagles prepare it and practice it compared to what other teams do. And if the other teams are simply making that assumption as well, like this is a straightforward play, it's going to be easy, and you run it a couple times in practice, and then that's what you have going into the game, it could still just be completely apples and oranges compared to what the Eagles are doing if the preparation levels are entirely different.
Yep. Fair point. In which case you would assume that a lot of those teams that tried to copycat it in season last year are going to take the time this offseason to try to really prepare it, right? To try to study what the Eagles are doing, to talk to defensive tackles about what the offensive linemen are doing. Because I don't have any like clear additional insight to be clear. But the one thing that I did go back a little bit, because I've made this point a couple times, because I've heard the stuff about Jalen Hurts squatting so much and being such a strong quarterback. And the point that I've made is that I don't think it was Hurts' strength pushing the pile. Because by my recollection, most of his QB sneaks were the offensive line winning, were like they blow defensive lines back 3 yards into the end zone. And I did go back and watch Jalen Hurts rushing touchdown. That's the one thing that I was just about to say that I've done. And that's what I saw. Was what I remembered. Like, I mean, yeah, confirmation bias. But I mean, I would encourage people to go look at it. There's a YouTube video out there that's all of Jalen Hurts' touchdowns. It includes his passing TDs, but it's a cut up and it includes all of the short yardage rushing TDs. Go watch it yourself. There's like 15. It doesn't take that long. My argument is the offensive line is winning on the vast majority of them. Yes, it helps to have Jalen Hurts' strength, but in most cases, even when sometimes he's like not even contacting anyone, he's just falling forward behind his line. Sometimes he does contact, but even in those cases, he's then getting pushed from behind. He's certainly generating some stuff. He's obviously adding to it to be, but his strength is obviously helpful. But it also sometimes feels like when he kind of has to wait for the line to finish winning, I guess, on their push, that like they just continue to push. And again, if you watch the defensive lines, they wind up on their butt like 3 yards back, right? Like they're able to move them. And then when you watch the other teams do at the end of last season, that was the stark contrast for me, was that the quarterbacks thought they could just fall forward and they were hitting a wall. The defensive lines weren't moving. And so to your point, if that is the case, then maybe what we will see is offensive lines around the league trying to practice, offensive line coaches, teams, whatever, trying to practice whatever it is the Eagles are doing or study it. And maybe the additional preparation will lead to more quarterbacks having a lot more success in the Jalen Hurts mold. It'll be interesting to see. I'm not trying to say that Jalen Hurts is not a unique player either. I think he's good at it. I just don't think it's like unique to his physical skill set. I do think it is something that is taught, like you were saying. And maybe it's not just Jason Kelsey either. I doubt it's just Jason Kelsey. It's very interesting. It's a big
Well, I
subject.
mean, across that interior group, they created a lot of space. We're like, how does? I mean, he, as you say, I mean, he's just more or less strolling forward for whatever yardage he needs. My fear would be, and I don't know if it's fear exactly, but would be that you're going to get the Taysom Hill player on the individual teams that are going to run it. And it's not going to be a QB play. And so you don't get additional touchdowns for the quarterbacks, and you potentially lose some running back touchdowns
Yeah.
from the teams that do kind of set up to make that play work.
Yeah, that would be annoying. But yeah, to your point about the different quarterbacks, I mean, I would at least have some concern that Hurts's rushing touchdowns could go away, but maybe they won't, and that's fits really well with the things that we could be wrong about. I haven't necessarily even been playing it that way. I think on individual drafts, you have to look at upside scenarios. So, like for Jalen Hurts, I mean, I've taken him. I've stacked him with AJ Brown. I've stacked him with Devonta Smith. I've taken him in the super flex puppy that we're going to talk about in a little bit here. When I get the 102 pick, because he tends to go 102 and Allen goes 101. Because I can also see the scenario where he just runs 15 touchdowns again, and that's great. That's a player that you want to have, obviously. But I would take Allen first. As we get back to the Bills, though, when you were talking about Curtis Samuel, I did want to offer the listeners a different interpretation, I will say, because you gave some good thoughts about why he's a little bit of a role player. Some of the elements about him running fewer routes and how that impacts the targets per out run and those things. He does have so you referenced how in 2022 he was down at 17%, or you mentioned a much lower number. I'm looking at PFF's numbers here. We often talk about this. We have slightly different routes numbers between our sources. In 2022, he was down by my numbers at 17%. Last year, he was at 21.1% on fewer routes. But it was fewer routes than even last year. And it wasn't just a role-playing thing. He left 2 games early last year where he played fewer than 20% of the team snaps. He also missed a game 1 week after one of those. So he was a little bit banged up in the middle of the season. And then played a little bit less down the stretch. And I think maybe as a result, or you can make that case, his route percentages in the first half of the season, I'm looking at them right now. I mean, there's a few different ways I could parse it, but noticeably higher. It was 82% in week 1. It was 80% in week 3. He only hit 80% once more the rest of the year. It was 73% in week 4. Right after that, he actually only hit 70% once more the rest of the year. So the first 3 of the first 4 weeks, he was really high. His first injury happens in week 8. He was 66 and 69%, 5 and 6. Anyway, noticeably higher in the early part of the season, at least to me, to my eye. I'm not saying that that's the only reason. Those are still not elite numbers. He's not a 95% route runner. I agree with that take completely. But
Ben, one of my mild concerns here would be, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on it, because it's probably fluky, right? But it's 2 years in a row where the team got a good look at him in the first half of the year, different offensive coordinators, different quarterbacks. And in both seasons, they de-emphasize him in the second half.
I mean, that's a fair point. I'm not saying he's like a definite superstar, but in terms of like, that's a good additional point. I don't even have a counter to that point. But where I wanted to go with this, though, a little bit further is stretching back before 2022. 2021, he got hurt. He only ran 37 routes. 2020, he also had a 21 plus targets per route run on a 400 plus route season. It's actually his best yards per route run season. 2019 is the year where he ran a ton of routes, 647. Really low targets per route run. It's the year he had a bunch of air yards, high ADOT roll. I mean, people might remember this, but he had like an absurd number of air yards for a really low number of actual receiving yards. He wasn't very good as a deep receiver. He had a 14.8 ADOT that year in Carolina. 2018, going all the way back to his second year. I'm going way, way back now, but it's the other year where he ran decent route numbers. It was only 298, but he was over 20% targets per route that year as well. So 2 of the last. I got to figure out how to frame this one as well. 3, I guess, of the last 5 years, or of the 5 years in his career where he's run at least 200 routes, a decent number of routes. He's had similar targets per out run in that 20 to 21% range. 2022, which you referenced, is kind of the outlier, although 2019 is also the other outlier, which is when he was in that deep threat role. And so the way that I frame the Curtis Samuel thing to myself is like he's at least shown some target earning ability. And one of the things that happens with some of these guys that consistently in different situations have these decent per route numbers is when they get into an offense like this where there's not really a clear winner of targets, that they can have a bump and a career high, and we see them go to like 23% for that 1 year. And that's the like he's shown me enough in a couple of different seasons to be like this guy can earn some ball. And but you made a good point as well that the ADOT's really low. There's some manufactured touches here. He isn't a full-time route running receiver. Some of it is, hey, we're gonna bring him in and use him in jet motion and do a tip pass to him or something. That's part of why his targets per route run is high. But I also think the Bills might do some of that stuff, and they might use him like Cole Beasley, who saw his numbers, targets per route run numbers bump up and have some career high in targets as a slot guy for Josh Allen a few years ago. The other thing I would say about him, when you actually look at the raw numbers as it relates to a lot of those different stats, some years he did run 650 routes, like I said, some years a lot lower. But over the last 5 years, other than the year that he got injured in 2021, where he only ran the 30, whatever it was, routes, he's had 90 plus targets the other 4 seasons. The last 2 full seasons he played in Carolina, both of the 2 years in Washington. Now, the point you made about them de-emphasizing him in both of those Washington seasons, like I said, don't really have a strong counter to that. But the fact of the matter is, like, he's been a 92. Now his career high is 105 targets. He's not been 110 plus ever, but he's been between 90 and 105 targets in his last 4 seasons where he's actually played part of the season, right? So 4 of the last 5 years, because he missed most of that 5th season in 2021, his first year in Washington. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know what Curtis Samuel really is. I don't think he's like a clear ceiling play, but he is somebody that I look at and I go, like, this guy has at least been pretty involved in a lot of different offenses with some good players around him. Those Carolina teams, he had DJ Moore. These Washington teams had Terry McLaurin and a first round pick in Jahan Dotson running a lot of routes. And I mean, he's at least earned volume. He's consistently like made himself a part of the offense. And I just think also, if you look at what the Bills have done, although, I mean, actually, I want to stop myself right there and actually make the counterpoint. I was going to say, when you look at the Bills have done, not really adding anyone else, you have to look at him favorably. But the counterpoint would be that the Bills have just been grabbing a bunch of broken parts like Marcus Valdez-Scantling and Chase Claypool and all these guys. And maybe I'm wrong and the fantasy community is wrong for elevating Curtis Samuel above that. And maybe he's just, in their mind, another one of those, those spare parts. Although they did give him, $15 million in guarantees and a 3-year contract and an earlier agreement in free agency than like Marcus Valdez-Scantling they brought in May after the draft. That timeline probably matters a little bit as well. I'm not like sold on him, but I do think because somebody probably has to do something here, I take more Kincaid at a much higher price. So I think we're actually very similar in this perspective. Although the question then becomes, is Samuel draftable? Basically, I think he's shown enough throughout his career to be like, this could be the guy that's at least a part of the hierarchy on a less concentrated offense, but where he is, as you said, if you draft him at that price, he's got to give you something. It's not just 1 week spike week potential in the fantasy playoffs. I'm saying, like, he gives you that. He gives you 100 targets over the course of the year. I think Samuel is a pretty good bet for that if he's healthy. But yeah, anyway, that would be the sort of the counter explanation, because you kind of asked that question, like, what would be the argument for Samuel? Is it just kind of a bet on like vacated targets? I do think there's enough in Samuel's profile in the last several years. It's a lot of good but not great target earning seasons.
And some people are probably thinking about Samuel, some of those years that you went back to are pretty irrelevant, but he's someone who came into the league very young and is just going to be 28 this August. Now, 28 isn't young, obviously, but there's a difference between somebody who could have that breakout type of season that you mentioned at 28 in the perfect situation compared to somebody who's, 31 and is like basically just being brought in to be, a peripheral piece. It's interesting as we look at the risers over the last 3 weeks that I would kind of think of three of these guys as being odd in that it is sort of a vertical element or this idea that maybe they could change their target earning profile. In the Jamison Williams, he's gone up almost 10 picks. And this is, again, looking at guys who had ADPs in the top 10 rounds. I guess I don't really think that that's justified, but I have changed my ranking on him and I'm drafting him because I do think that, I mean, he has the type of athleticism that cannot be effectively dealt with if he does what he's supposed to do. And certainly when you also have to account for the other players on that team. Rashid Shaheed is somebody I liked a lot last year. I really have no clue how he's risen from like 120 to 113 in the 2024 season. Now, again, that's sort of a target volume. And where does it go other than the Chris Olave type of look? He is electric, but again, you've got to be able to draw targets. He didn't do that last year in his second season.
And last year, you could say, you know, where does it go? I mean, Michael
Thomas didn't
go
to him.
Some, but yeah, and it didn't go to him.
And then Khalil Shakir has gone from about 116 to about 109, which I like him. I think he could be a breakout. I mean, you're paying for all of that and more when you're drafting him at that level. But then a couple of the other interesting names that are kind of in this range are guys that we talked about, and that Tyler Lockett is actually going up. So the thing that we discussed here, he's risen about 7 picks in the last 3 weeks. So people are moving in that direction. The other one that's interesting, because you and I had both discussed before the show started this idea that he was actually falling to us now, but part of it may be that he's falling at a new ADP. Cortland Sutton is up 6.6. And I do think that he is fascinating when you look at the bigger picture. Now, one of the things that's a little bit odd there, I think that you have like the tension here between, as we move away from the draft, we're going to have the rookies start to fall again until we start to get the big puff pieces for them at camp. And the guys who do seem to be part of the team's plans, like we got with Laporta last season, are going to really separate. And then a lot of the other, especially some of the people who weren't drafted early, are going to fall. And you think about someone like a Troy Franklin who is falling, obviously a third-day pick, that makes sense. And yet,
and Mims keeps getting so much positive buzz. And I think there's people that have talked about maybe Josh Reynolds is actually like going to play the third wide receiver position, and that Mims and Franklin are going to overlap a little. So I think there's a little bit of a, if Mims is getting the positive buzz, then Franklin gets the negative buzz kind of thing. You're smiling pretty. The thought of Josh Reynolds being relevant has broken Shawn.
It makes me sad. However, again, I mean, there's a possibility that Sutton isn't part of this, but I do want to mention the fact that it is weird to me that Jerry Jeudy and Cortland Sutton have different narratives surrounding them when Jeudy is the younger player. And again, I think contextually, you have this element where Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle have been good NFL players, and they were similar, but not quite what he was in college. Now, again, we've got a lot more information since then that should be weighted much more heavily. But you look at last season, and the SIS numbers have Jeudy and Sutton in almost a dead heat in terms of target per route, slight edge to Sutton, but the same exact number in terms of yards per target. So they're very, very close in yards per route run. Now, the thing that really separates them there, the other thing is they have almost identical weighted target per route numbers. And so you don't have
shocking how similar their stats were last year. I've never seen anything like it.
It really is, especially when you think about how you conceptualize the season, where you think about Sutton as the deep guy, you think about him as the person who won last year, you think about Jeudy as being not just bad, but like apocalyptically bad.
Yep.
And then you look at their numbers and you're like, okay, well, they're actually kind of similar. You know, one of the things that happened that does matter is that Cortland Sutton scored touchdowns and Jerry Jeudy did not. But then, you know, you look at the last
on the touchdown,
10-2. You look at the last 2 seasons combined, though, and again, it's kind of interesting. You get different coaches, you have different quarterbacks. I should say you have different ways in which Russell Wilson was awful in the 2 seasons, and you do get different quarterback play at the end. But you look at those 2 seasons together, and they both play 31 games. Cortland Sutton goes for 123 receptions, Jerry Jeudy 121. The touchdown gap is smaller, and then it's 12-8 in favor of Sutton. The yardage numbers actually favor Jeudy by 130, and his air yard numbers and air yards per target, again, pretty similar there. There's a air yards edge to Sutton, but the ADOT is basically the same. And then you look at the yards after the catch, and Jerry Jeudy more than doubles him. So when we kind of think through the flexibility that a player would offer, I think that we tend to not give Jerry Jeudy enough credit for what he does with the ball in his hands, and two, to also think of him as being a little bit more of an underneath threat than he really is. So then that kind of brings me back to where these two guys are. And I kind of like selecting Cortland Sutton when he falls, because that allows me to get some diversity in the exposures away from Franklin and away from Mims, which I'm going to very naturally have a lot of, since I like Bo Nix and since I like that game. So things you mentioned as you were framing this for everyone in the intro. But when you get Cortland Sutton at a discount to his price and into this group, especially if Tyler Lockett is gone, I mean, you could argue that Cortland Sutton isn't just the end of a tier, but but that it's a tier where, you know, again, it just completely falls off the table. There's no one else that you really need to draft after that point. But the interesting thing is that Jerry Jeudy is actually going 2.5 rounds later, and he's going into a situation where you have a crappy, like, sexual predator QB, but somebody who has a lot of experience in the NFL and might come back with a healthier shoulder. You have
new offensive coordinator. There's reasons people have been optimistic that maybe Deshaun Watson will actually figure it out at this point.
And certainly I think that you have to like Kevin Stefanski from a big picture perspective. You think about Elijah Moore and how he busted completely as the number 2 receiver there last year. You think about Amari Cooper and how he had, in many ways, one of his best seasons, and yet where he is age-wise and what he really does bring to the table, probably from a talent perspective at this point. Obviously, David Njoku factors in. We like Njoku, think that he's probably pretty reasonably valued. There's no reason that we have to specifically contrast Sutton and Jeudy simply because they were on the same team last year. But I do wonder if, when you go back and you look at Jerry Jeudy's numbers, he seems pretty draftable still. And if he's locked into the number 2 role, or even if it's a 1A, 1B, which, would certainly be an optimistic way to look at it. But similar to talking about like DK Metcalf versus Tyler Lockett, when we're talking about Amari Cooper being wide receiver 29 at the 10-10, and then Jerry Jeudy wide receiver 59 at the 11-6, those guys wouldn't have to even be that close together in scoring for Jeudy to be a slam dunk.
And we were talking about the team or the game situation and the build stuff as it relates to Sutton. But there's a thing where, I'm taking a lot of Tyreek Hill and a lot of Jalen Waddle and a lot of Achane. Not a ton of Achane, but then a decent amount of Mostert. Like, you want to be in on the Dolphins. And so his week 17 matchup, I just wanted to pull up my exposures, and I have always been a Jerry Jeudy skeptic, but I've been actually drafting him a decent amount. I'm at 12% right now in this specific subset of my exposures. It doesn't include pre-draft, and it doesn't include like the eliminators and the super flex tournaments. And anyway, it's a little bit ahead of expected, right? A little bit overweight. It's not super, super high, but I have been drafting him. And now that you just made that case, Sean, again, I've always, this, I've always been a little bit of a Judy skeptic, but I don't know how you don't draft him in every single draft. There's no other receivers in his range that make any sense. They traded for him and then gave him $41 million in guarantees. $28 million was newly guaranteed. 3-year, $52 million contract extension. I think some of it is a little bit that idea of funny money, but it's a multiple year commitment. There's dead money into like year 3, like significant dead money, 10 million of dead money into 2026. 3 years of a commitment. There's a bunch of void years at the back of it, and I don't know how much of it is like fully guaranteed. Oh, this over the cap actually says 41 million is fully guaranteed. This the contract notes just says in guarantees, so I was a little bit confused there. 41 million of fully guaranteed. I know I constantly throw out numbers with contracts, but like when I was talking about Samuel a little bit ago and talking about that being favorable, it was nowhere near $41 million. Like this is a real contract that should keep this player outside of or inside of the wide receiver window, outside of being drafted at 126 for a wide receiver. That's a significant mispricing by the market. I think they're just sick of drafting Jerry Jeudy. I mean, there's no real other explanation. And because of the dynamic where once you get to that point in the draft, you can't really find any other receivers that you're like you said, they're situational picks. And this is a perfect way to frame it. At that point, you can draft receivers. They should be stacked up. And you're telling yourself, I think you said scenario-based picks. And they're all scenario-based picks. Jerry Jeudy's not a scenario-based pick, man. He should be up there in the Cortland Sutton range, if not higher. I'm completely sold. And I'm not even sold on Jerry Jeudy as a talent necessarily, but it's just a clear mispricing, which, when we emphasize these things, they often go away. But at this point, draft more Jerry Jeudy because I promise you, the case that Sean just made, he's going to make again. And Jerry Judy's not going to go 126 in August. He can't. That's his ADP right now.
Let's try and keep it down by pointing out that Jerry Jeudy, when you watch him, seems small and slow and doesn't catch the ball very well and doesn't score touchdowns. So, but going back to the point that you were also making, it's not that you have to have like every single one of these teams or even the week 15 and week 16 stacks are going to be definitive, although they could be. I mean, week 15 went very well for me last season, and that jump between having someone just in and then being in the semifinals, Ben, that feels hugely different in terms of how you look back on your season. If week 15, people tend to talk about like, is week 16 more important? Is week 17 more important? It's like, well, I'll tell you what.
To your mental health, it is.
Like, right. But week 15 to 16, you get those guys actually in and across. And you're talking about how many teams you have in the semifinals. That's in some ways the week where, again, all the weeks matter. But that Cleveland run of Kansas City, where you can put them with all of your fun Chiefs picks, including obviously Xavier Worthy. And then with the Cincinnati Bengals and all the fun guys there. And then with the Dolphins, as you mentioned, if the Bengals, not the Bengals, if the Browns are good this season and they're making a push and Deshaun Watson plays well, they're going to go play 4 games to finish the season that are very, very difficult. They're week 18, which is less, important, obviously, for fantasy against Baltimore. But they have to play the Chiefs, the Bengals, and the Dolphins, and those are going to be shootouts, right? I mean, they have a good defense. Whether or not they'll be the same level is going to depend on defensive injuries and that type of thing. But for them to beat those teams, are they going to hold down Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow, and Tua in 3 consecutive weeks? Jerry Jeudy, baby.
Yeah, I think it's a great case. But now our premise, Sean, was players that we might be wrong on, and now we're just talking about players that we like. Were there other?
Well, it was the Cortland Sutton thing. I think is always interesting, and I'm always wondering if I'm wrong on him. I do think that a wide receiver 49, you got to strongly consider him, and so that would be the case for me, is the Sutton versus Franklin and Mims, especially if what we're going to get is Josh Reynolds. You want to be aware of that as you're setting your teams up. But I do think that the flip side of that, and something you also have to think through, is just that this gap between him and Jerry Jeudy, that has the perceived gap, which is very clearly giving us these differences in prices, I don't think is there. And if you told me at the end of the year that Deshaun Watson had a big season and Bo Nix had a poor season, I would be disappointed, but I certainly wouldn't be shocked by any stretch. And even though maybe you're going to say Cortland Sutton, the clear number one, Jerry Jeudy, the clear number two, maybe he's the number three behind David Njoku. We've discussed how that's not necessarily the way to look at it. And if the Browns thrive and the Bengals struggle, it's going to be very, very relevant. And so I guess partly for me, it would be like, what if the Browns are better than we think?
Yeah.
What if Deshaun Watson starts to make news again as an NFL player?
As an NFL player. And it's annoying, but when you talk about ADPs, you talk about, the next quarterback that comes off the board after him is Baker Mayfield, who I can't bring myself to click. New offensive coordinator, never had any rushing value, only threw 28 touchdowns last year in his great season, where his number one stayed healthy and had 13 TDs. Didn't really throw any touchdowns to anyone else. He had 15 TDs to the rest of the team. It's not like a pocket passer has to throw 30 plus TDs for me to care. And he doesn't have the offensive coordinator that just helped him. I don't know how you can even really draft Baker. Geno's behind him. That's one we just talked about, some upside. Will Levis is the next one after that. We've talked about how his profile is basically one really good debut game and then a lot of questionable stats. JJ McCarthy, Bryce Young, Derek Carr. Derek Carr's probably underpriced relative to just a floor that he can provide you, but that's the quarterbacks behind Deshaun Watson. Eventually you get to Daniel Jones, you get Drake May, you get Bo Nix. But Daniel Jones, Pat Crane mentioned to me, injury guarantee in his contract that makes it really hard to imagine that they would leave him out there for all 17 games. It's the same thing as what happened with Russell Wilson last year, where he was arguably playing okay, and they just benched him because they knew they were going to cut him in the offseason. They didn't want more of his money to get guaranteed. And he was like, I'm healthy and I want to play. It became a whole story in season for anyone who doesn't remember.
Right.
Could happen with Daniel Jones.
It could happen. I don't think it's guaranteed to happen in the same way it was virtually guaranteed for Russell Wilson, because the Broncos were bad. The coach had nothing on the line.
Yeah.
Everybody in New York is going to get fired if Daniel Jones gets benched.
That's a good point.
So I think they're, and that's not to say that he couldn't still get benched, right? But
they don't care about the $23 million injury guarantee. They might all get fired. You're right.
Yeah. They have to play.
Not their money. Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's $23 million. It's a big number. So, I could still definitely, it's like, I think you framed it well. It's not guaranteed. It's not the same thing as Russell Wilson at all. It is concerning, but I've drafted him. He's a reasonable pick late. You've drafted Justin Fields. You've talked about as a reasonable pick late. And yet all of those names I just mentioned are the guys going, immediately after Deshaun Watson, who at one point in his career led the NFL in passing yards, right? Or passer rating. What was the stat? I want to go look it up. Passing yardage for a mobile QB to lead the NFL in passing yardage, in addition to that was in 2020, his last season as a 16-game starter. He missed all of 2021. He's only played in 6 games each of the last 2 years. He only played 12 total games the last 2 years. It's been bad. And we all, frankly, have enjoyed that. But, maybe not everybody, but he doesn't have a lot of people rooting for him in his corner at this stage, obviously. But a player that, for each of his first 4 years in his career was a plus passer. You go look at I'm on his Pro Football Reference page. You look at his, there's the adjusted yards per attempt plus stat they have, where 100 is supposed to be league average. He was well above 100 in that every single year, his first 4 years. His AYA is, 7.7 at its lowest, 9.5 at its highest. His yards per attempt led the league in 2020 as well. His yards per completion led the league. His overall yardage led the league in a season where he ran for 440 yards, 444 yards as well. If you are a mobile quarterback who can lead the league in passing yardage, you can score fantasy points at a really high level. If Cleveland's good, Deshaun Watson's unfortunately going to be the best pick in fantasy in late round quarterbacks.
He could do very well.